Hi everyone, thanks for joining. My name is Minnie Rahman from the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, and I'll be talking today with Leah Cowan. Leah is the former politics editor at Galdem and has written for Vice, Open Democracy and The Guardian. She works at Project 17, an advice centre which supports migrant families, and Leah is going to be talking to us today about her new book, Border Nation, which is now available. And if you haven't already bought it, you can use the discount code JCWI20 to get 20% off. I think most of you will have that already in your email somewhere, but it will be posted again in the chat. So Leah and I will be talking for 40 minutes, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. And if you have any questions, do drop them into the chat and we'll come back to them at the end. Hi, Leah.
Hi, Minnie.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing okay, thanks. We were just saying it's been a bit of a stressful day for many reasons, but yeah, I'm very glad to be here talking with you.
Yeah, it definitely has been one of those days which has just been really chaotic for anyone in the kind of migrants' rights movements. And I think that that's actually a really good point to start on, because, you know, what I found today very, very stressful. And I think a lot of people watching this and a lot of people who are interested in migrants' rights will have seen the stuff happening today and be possibly feeling a little bit down. But Border Nation, the way you've written it, it tells the story of Britain's border regime through the lens of transformative resistance. And I really enjoyed the stories of resistance that you highlighted, the ones that were led by migrants and people of colour. So I think maybe we should start with a little bit of hope, a little bit of inspiration. And could you tell us about any stories that you were particularly inspired by in the book?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously in the face of all of the kind of horrific structures and systems, the things that inspire me are the people who are kind of fighting and organizing and using lots of different tactics along the way to kind of break down the border regime. There's a really great campaign called Step Up Migrant Women, which is led by women at the Latin American Women's Rights Service, and it shines a light on the experiences of migrant women who face intersecting oppression. So as women of color, as migrant women who face aggression from a perpetrator, perhaps in a domestic abuse situation, and then also face aggression from the state, who's trying to kind of destabilize their ability to reside in the country. And this campaign has done some really brilliant work. They released a research report called Right to be Believed, which really laid out the impact of the hostile environment on migrant women who are also survivors of abuse. So I think that campaign is a really kind of good example of the fight back that's going on, from the kind of research and that kind of angle. I'm also really inspired by protests inside detention centers. So as many people listening will know, detention centers are places where people who are kind of locked up indefinitely face incredible levels of repression and victimization for speaking up. And there've been kind of significant hunger strikes and protests throughout the years. There was a significant one in Yarlswood, which is a detention center which detains mainly women, in 2018. And that was ahead of a charter flight to Nigeria and Ghana. They were called the Hunger for Freedom strikes. And detention centres are, you know, effectively category B high security facilities where people are detained indefinitely without any access to proper nourishing food or healthcare or kind of adequate scrutiny. You know, journalists aren't allowed in, even the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women was turned away. And in spite of this very kind of controlled and oppressive environment, people continue to resist and have their voices heard. And I just find that incredibly inspiring, and it really kind of lights a path for us to follow in our struggle against the border regime.
Yeah, there's definitely tons of really amazing work that are going on in kind of detention centres. And as you said, the Step Up Migrant Women campaign is so important, kind of particularly now, with the government making lots of changes to immigration rules and even policing and the kind of concept of protest. And you just briefly touched on there, you know, you touched on kind of detention and deportation and charter flights. And one of the main areas of kind of conversation around charter flights has been around kind of Windrush generation and the concept of Britishness. And you start the book by talking about the British Empire and what it actually means to be British. And that concept of Britishness, it comes back time and time again and is increasingly used by the government as a way to deny people their rights. You know, you hear politicians say things like, this will protect British people, or this will protect a British way of life. To what extent do you think the idea of Britishness is a myth?
I think what is missing from Britain's kind of conception of itself is that Britain has a very long history which extends far beyond its own shores, right? And I'm kind of talking here about colonization and the transatlantic slave trade and the long-term impact of those kind of violent campaigns of brutalization and dehumanization. And what we're living with is an overwhelming failure to reckon with that history. The kind of half-told story that we have is the lukewarm fire that the mythology of Britain is forged within. And I was thinking about this. I watched this documentary the other day called James Baldwin in Paris. He's one of my favorite writers. And there's a line where he's just kind of sat in an art studio with a whiskey and this really great turtleneck, similar to the one I'm wearing. And he sits back and says, I would not be a white American for all the tea in China, all the oil in Texas. I really wouldn't like to have to live with all those lies. And it really made me think about the kind of incredible weight of white supremacy and the fictions and the merry dances that uphold it. And I think one of those, and I mentioned this in the book, is this idea that Britain is this benign little kind of quaint sailboat bobbing on a sparkling sea, and that it's just a country that got lucky and got rich. And obviously that's not how the world works, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch. The Industrial Revolution and the wealth kind of hoarded in this country was generated on the backs of our enslaved and exploited ancestors and working class people, including migrant communities in the UK. So, you know, when politicians talk about Britishness, it's really just a dog whistle for whiteness. And we see that happening across the political spectrum. And it's not just the usual suspects, right? Whether it's, you know, in the wake of the general election in 2019, we had Jess Phillips talking about Labour's betrayal of the British working class, when actually, you know, most of the most diverse communities did vote for Labour. Or whether it's, you know, Keir Starmer in June saying that Black Lives Matter, which was giving a voice to something that a lot of people in Britain were feeling and was really important. He said it was a moment, not a movement. And it becomes clear kind of what these people's vision of Britain is, and it doesn't involve seemingly kind of widespread popular anti-racist protests. So yeah, I think when people talk about Britishness, particularly politicians, we have to really delve into what they mean by that. And actually there's a long history which gives a bit more context to what Britain is and what has made it what it is today.
Yeah, definitely. And like, as you said there's this kind of distinction being made about the white working class and migrant communities, and kind of the idea of who is British is actually really not distinct from the relationship between, you know, race and class and gender. And that is very much one of the themes in the book that you talk about. And obviously that has long fingers. It really affects the border regime, really affects marginalized communities here and crosses over in those intersections. And some of those communities that, you know, that are particularly affected are groups like sex workers and the trans community and the traveller Roma Gypsy community. And you mentioned Jess Phillips there because she is, you know, one of the politicians who is quite vocal about some of the rights of some of these groups of people.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just wondered if you could maybe, you know, explain in some detail what the impacts of the border regime are on marginalized groups like the ones I mentioned, and what you think is needed to empower their voices and act in solidarity, particularly when you do have such loud voices from across the political spectrum speaking against them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the border regime absolutely kind of compounds and exacerbates kind of existing inequalities and injustices. So, exactly as you say, people living at the intersections of oppressions due to, racism, misogyny, transphobia, ableism, etc., experience the full might of border violence in a way that, an able-bodied, straight, white, middle-class, cisgender man, for example, just wouldn't. So in practice, we see that the border can be very fluid in how it permits capital and goods to kind of circulate around the globe. And yet we know that the border regime exists to promote the flow of these things while stemming the flow of the humans that produce the goods. And because of this, we can see that border restrictions are really neatly tied up in economics, in ideas about who is or isn't a productive economic unit, and who is or isn't a threat to the kind of stability and the productivity of an economy. And I think in this way, particularly when you're talking about the trans community, the border reproduces a very heteronormative idea of what a family or a relative is, and the way that our kind of family groups are put together in very kind of specifically, binaried and gendered ways of relating to each other. And we're seeing this now with the laws around kind of EEA nationals after Brexit around who constitutes a family member for the purposes of immigration law. And of course, being married to your partner and having only one partner is again reified within the border regime. Anything outside of this doesn't really hold weight when it comes to making the case for being allowed to, live with who you consider to be your family in the country that you feel you belong in. And so what I think is needed in that instance is this much kind of larger task of untangling or relearning how we imagine individuals within this kind of binary framework of gender, as well as communities and families, as well as unpicking, our worth from our economic productivity. And at the same time, to kind of touch on the other group you mentioned, we need kind of more action on the fact that workers need to have rights and safe and secure workplaces. So, for example, you mentioned sex workers and their experience of border violence. The decriminalization of sex work is a really important step because, we already know, and there's a really great book out about this called Revolting Prostitutes by Juno Mack and Molly Smith. And this book really kind of lays out the fact that clients will use a sex worker's insecure immigration status as leverage in negotiations or as a threat, which means that those sex workers are less able to report violence or abuse or exploitation in their workplace. And it's the border that keeps people in these exploitative working conditions. So what we need to do then to kind of show solidarity is work together, including in our unions, to kind of push back against the acceptance of border controls in our workplaces and push for the ending of, data sharing between public services such as the police and healthcare and the Home Office, so that if somebody who does have insecure immigration status and is experiencing, abuse at work can kind of get some recourse and get some support around that. I think those are really important steps.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, if anything, like the pandemic has kind of shown us that the way that we value work and workers and who people are is really different to what we would have said 2 years ago as a kind of public narrative, maybe not the narrative that people working in migrants' rights might have had. And, that is very much part of the reason why, JCWI as an organisation has been thinking about how we can stand up for all workers' rights, like not only the ones who are key workers or essential workers or high skilled or low skilled, but also the people who are undocumented, are definitely working in some kind of exploitative industry, because that's the way the hostile environment kind of sets it up. And I think you're really right to say that kind of the hostile environment compounds exploitation. It compounds it particularly for women and for vulnerable groups. For the groups who are already vulnerable, it adds another kind of layer of vulnerability onto that. And those are the kind of stories that we just don't kind of regularly hear. And I think, your kind of experience as the politics editor at Galdem, and as you talk about in the book, you have a clear sense of the media landscape and the stories that we hear and how that kind of disseminates into the public consciousness and can perpetuate strong kind of myths about migrants, or even that perpetuate that kind of good, bad migrant, key workers are great, everyone else is not. What do you think that we can do, or campaigners or activists or anyone listening can do to hold the media to account? Or I'm even kind of interested in how we can use the media to our advantage to win some of these battles.
Yeah, I think that really is the question. I think it's tricky because the idea of holding something to account relies upon that seeing itself as accountable to someone or something. And the American activist and prison abolitionist Mariam Kaba kind of talks about this idea of accountability, right? It's not something that you can push on somebody. It's something that has to be taken and engaged in wholeheartedly by that person or that institution. Otherwise, kind of what you're talking about is a form of punishment. So I think we have to see the mass media for what it is, in essence, a business where, you know, agendas are very much driven and steered by business incentives. So how to get people onto pages, how to get people to buy, you know, print journalism. And sometimes that is through genuinely kind of useful and insightful reporting. Lots of times it's through very sensationalized, violent, exploitative material that's classist and racist and sexist and transphobic and ableist and more. And this happens because, well, from what I've observed, the vast majority of media outlets are not kind of underpinned in their work with a political understanding or purpose or strategy around what they're putting out and the potential impact it might have, beyond just kind of publishing good stories that have a public interest angle. And that's kind of because they're not, you know, overtly political bodies. They're these non-partisan businesses, which might be left-leaning or right-leaning, but ultimately, you know, you'll see the same transphobic story in The Guardian and in the Daily Mail, but just framed with different language and pointed at a different audience. So kind of getting onto your question, knowing this, I think we can utilize the media and engage with the media on our own terms when we are trying to get out messages. But it shouldn't be our only tactic. It's a very important tactic, I think, but it can't be our only one. I think more specifically, we can be very proactive with kind of pitching news stories about the issues that we want to raise the profile of, and not feel obliged to be reactive and just kind of respond to every question about, like, is the monarchy racist? Because we know it is, right? It's not up for debate. We don't need to kind of perform rage at every crumb of racism. I think that's a bit of a distraction, and it doesn't serve our campaigns. It kind of drags us off track and gives this kind of false sense of what campaigners and activists and people who are engaged in anti-racist struggles are talking about and working on, which is not, you know, the monarchy. We're talking about like issues in the here and now that affect vast swathes of people. So I think the trick is about kind of being proactive and being clear about what it is that we want to communicate, and not being dragged by the kind of media agendas, really.
Yeah, I mean, kind of just on that topic of, you know, the things that are happening kind of here and now, you know, we've got a whole bunch of stuff happening from Parliament and from politicians, introduction of kind of new legislation that crosses loads of issues. And you talk a lot about in the book about the relationship between detention, deportation and policing. And obviously policing is a conversation that everyone is having at the moment in light of the kind of tragic death of Sarah Everard and the protests that are also happening afterwards. And I think that relationship between kind of detention, deportation, and seeing it as an extension, a bad extension of the criminal justice system is often quite overlooked in that conversation about policing. And the UK is clearly moving towards further criminalisation of migrants, and appears to be following a kind of Trump-style camp system that we've seen with Napier barracks. Why do you think that the public hasn't connected those conversations, or there hasn't been a huge kind of public outrage? There has been some outrage about the barracks, but kind of, for me, it feels like everyone should be outraged about it. Why isn't everyone outraged about it? And do you think that there's anything that we can learn from what happened in the USA when Trump kind of instigated those camps, and then obviously now we've gotten to a point where Biden is sort of looking at what they look like and maybe changing some of those laws. Do you think there's anything we can learn from what happened there?
I mean, I think on the kind of criminalisation of migrants specifically, as you say, there hasn't been a huge outcry against the Napier barracks in the same way that, you know, people have been campaigning to end immigration detention in this country for decades. But it's only kind of gradually that we're getting media cut through on it. And I think this is for, I don't know, a range of reasons, really. For one, journalists aren't allowed inside immigration detentions in the UK, so it's hard to kind of report on the issue. Another fact is that the kind of actual infrastructure of immigration detention centres has developed and become more robust and resilient. So we're seeing less kind of incidents that draw media attention, such as big fires. And it's much harder to get a journalist to report on a story where there aren't really any visuals. People inside detention don't have access to the internet or camera phones, so it's hard to kind of represent what's happening beyond verbatim kind of testimonies, which you can read on Detained Voices, which is a really great website. So I guess my point is people don't really know about immigration detention on a mass scale. Everybody that I've ever spoken to who's kind of outside of the migrants' rights sector is very shocked to learn about it. I mean, within the framework of like institutional racism in this country, it shouldn't be shocking, but like they're shocked to learn about it. And so there's a kind of big education and public awareness piece that is being tirelessly worked on by people like you to kind of get the message out about what's happening. I think the other issue about immigration detention specifically is that it kind of sits at this nexus of two ideas in the public imagination, and that's the migrant and the prison. And I think in the public imagination, broadly, prisons need to exist and they keep us safe, and people locked inside them are dangerous and a threat. And then on top of that, we've got, you know, over a decade of hostile environment rhetoric, on top of many more, you know, racist decades spanning from the Rivers of Blood speech and, you know, violent street and state racism that's followed, on top of centuries of oppression through colonialism and slavery. So the idea then of the migrant is something that has been intensively vilified in the public imagination. So the idea of a prisons for migrants is basically the kind of perfect concoction for a right-wing and or hostile environment loving audience. The idea that some people deserve to be in the UK and some don't is such a kind of rigid concept to try and dismantle. The work on this is being done, but obviously it's slow and steady work. I think in terms of learning lessons around what we've seen with the Trump-style camps, I think it just has to keep pushing us down that road of abolition, right? It's not about making things nicer. It's not about, oh, let's, you know, have a nicer camp for children or a separate camp for women, or let's have murals on the wall. Like, it's not about rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Like, these things cannot exist. We need detention centers to be abolished. We need to shut them down. And I think we can learn the lessons and see what's happened in America and kind of say, you know, that we can't wait for that things to progress in that way. We need to kind of call for them to be shut down right now.
Yeah, totally. And kind of just on detention, I think one of the I say interesting, it's not interesting, but one of the most interesting things about it is that detention also sits at, as you say, this kind of nexus, but it's also at the nexus of between privatization and kind of profitability in the border regime, which you talk about quite comprehensively in the book. And COVID over the last year has definitely allowed for a more public conversation about privatization in general. So, you know, with Serco Track and Trace getting a lot of airtime, and obviously Serco are clearly involved in setting up border systems and the border regime alongside private companies like G4S and others. Do you kind of think there is a way to bring those conversations together and to help the public understand that, you know, this is two sides of the same coin, and actually what often happens to migrants and is that they're the kind of testing ground for things that are later expanded onto the rest of the public? And, you know, I think it's really important to kind of try and find a way to let the public know that, you know, privatization isn't creeping in a lot of sectors or industries. It's already there, and it's already dangerous. So do you think there's, I guess I'm asking is, do you think there's a way to kind of bring those conversations together and help the public understand that they need to be challenging that as well as kind of Serco track and trace?
Yeah, I do. I think the kind of profitability, as you say, of the border regime is absolutely something that we should be very alarmed about and take action on. And it absolutely goes hand in hand with privatization. So, as you say, detention centers, for example, serve both a kind of political and a monetary purpose. They're these profit-making ventures for private companies. I think all of the detention centers in the UK, except for one, are run by private companies. And there are 14 privately run prisons in the UK. So you can see how those two aspects of the kind of prison industrial complex are dovetailing and kind of expanding at the same time. And they also kind of suit government agendas that who can kind of say they're being tough on immigration. With detention centres, it's even less kind of evident that they're solving any social issues, which is the framing for why kind of prisons need to exist, apparently. Because migration isn't a social issue, it's the government response to migration that causes the issues in a context of centuries of racism and kind of legislative hostility to people coming to this country. But also because detention centres don't even meet their stated aim. The reason that we know they exist to make money is because they don't even function as they're supposed to. So in the past decade, the proportion of people who are removed or deported after being detained has nearly halved. And yet 25,000 people a year continue to be locked up indefinitely. And so we can absolutely see immigration detention as part of that, you know, web of institutions and laws, which is sometimes referred to as the prison industrial complex, which includes police, prisons, probation, surveillance, courts, tagging, all of these things, detention, deportation. And the move towards kind of having a discussion around abolition of these things is about looking at these institutions and recognizing that they don't solve social and economic issues. As Angela Davis says, they don't disappear social problems, they disappear human beings. And it's this idea of kind of out of sight, out of mind. I don't think the prison industrial complex solves the root causes of social issues because they are largely about inequality and the unfair distribution of resources, whether that's jobs or housing or healthcare or education. Immigration detention, I think, is a very profitable aspect of the prison industrial complex, and we're seeing the increased privatization of prisons too. And the police crime sentencing and courts bill is obviously part of this. So under the new bill, operating a prison academy will become a charitable activity, which means that funding prisons for children will guarantee people who kind of donate to those processes tax breaks. Police are getting, you know, larger powers, and meanwhile, the prison estates transformation program to kind of build these mega prisons is well underway. So I think, as you say, it's not something that's creeping, it's something that's happening right here, you know, right now in all aspects of the prison industrial complex. And the kind of response of abolition is about saying these institutions are doing harm. Why are they here? Are they profit-making enterprises that make money off human misery? And if so, you know, perhaps they have no place in our society.
Yeah. And you know, you're kind of talking about abolition there, and obviously abolition is one of those things that you say that you believe that something should be abolished, you know, abolish the police, abolish the Home Office, abolish ICE from the US, and obviously that is something that the kind of right, or even a lot of the middle and the centre left kind of respond to with kind of shock and horror. You know, how can you tear down a system that's been in place for 100 years? Like, of course that's a valid thing to call for and to ask for, and of course there are reasonable ways to do it. But I think, you know, you mentioned in the book, and you mentioned earlier on actually, that you kind of talk about the difference between calling for solutions now that will change people's lives, and how we balance that with a bigger picture, which is obviously abolishing all these structures. And the crux of it is a world without borders, because that is where all of these things come from. And, you know, I work for a charity, you also work for a charity, and I think this is a question that we as an organisation and also other people that I know, kind of, we have to think about it really holistically. You know, what do kind of the charitable sector campaigners and activists have to do to get to a world without borders, whilst also calling for the things now that will really help people. And it's kind of something that we have to balance. So, what do you kind of think the charitable sector needs to do, or do better, or do less of, to kind of get us there?
Oh, the charity sector. I have so many thoughts. Yeah, I mean, I wrote a blog post for Charity So White, which I'm sure you've heard of. Published a load of really interesting stuff around Black History Month. And I think a defining feature of the UK charity sector, which we both work in, is its kind of ongoing dance of neoliberalism. I can never say that word. What this means is, I think, is the kind of site for meaningful critique and action has actually shrunk as the sources of funding and kind of any kind of political will for real social change have dramatically reduced. And we saw that in, the 2010 election. The Conservative Party ran with their flagship big society policy in tandem with wholesale public funding cuts and kind of gutting of the welfare state. And David Cameron expressed his desire for a leaner, more efficient state, which involved encouraging charities and community groups to kind of step in where the state was effectively stepping out and washing its hands and saying, like, okay, you can take it from here, guys. And I think the kind of willful stripping back of the welfare state and the promotion of the idea that the tens of thousands of families that were pushed into poverty by austerity policies need to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps is the continuation of what Stuart Hall calls the long march of the neoliberal revolution. And he draws this kind of connecting line between Thatcherism through New Labour to the 2010 coalition government, reminding us that all of these political approaches which affect our sector have been characterised by protecting and prioritising profits over people. So, of course, I work for a charity, so I do believe that good and very kind of urgent, necessary work is being done in some spaces. I think in terms of what is our role, I think it's to carry out this work whilst also working with the more kind of radical and disruptive elements of, for example, anti-racist and migrants' rights movements to support the struggle, whether it's lobbying for changes to laws and policies which affect people's lives in the here and now, while at the same time continuing to recognise that the legal system has inequality kind of baked into its very bones. It's the thing that Audre Lorde said of the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We have to be quite kind of humble and realistic and recognise the limitations that exist if our only site for action is lobbying and campaigns directed towards politicians and policymakers, where we're kind of contributing in addition to that work to kind of public education, awareness raising, provision of vital services that enable people to fight back against these systems of oppression, both on a kind of personal but collective level, and where we're supporting widespread grassroots organising by people directly affected by the issues we work on. I think that's where the real change is happening.
Yeah, there is so much amazing work going on kind of at a grassroots level, and it really needs to, I mean, from my perspective, and I agree with basically everything you've said there, that the connection between those two things is really important and kind of increasingly more important, because you can only do so much lobbying to change a system. Change always happens from the bottom up, is how I kind of like to see it. Politicians are always the last people on board with anything.
Yeah.
So if you're not
to claim credit for it.
Exactly. So if you're not kind of looking at what's happening on the ground, talking to the people affected and allowing them to dictate in some way what you call for, you're never going to achieve kind of systemic or fundamental change. And I think that's a really important conversation to have in light of, what's happened today. And I don't know, I'm sure a lot of people listening will have kind of seen the news or seen at least some of the rhetoric that's been put out today about kind of asylum seekers and who they are, and the kind of crackdown that the government is trying to do on and allowing people to access safety, to enter the country, and also to just live their lives free from being bullied by the Home Office once they're in the UK. And I think in that context, it can feel really overwhelming. There's so much that campaigners could focus on or call for. You know, do we look at the asylum system? Do we look at the judiciary? Do we look at policing? Do we focus on the hostile environment? And of course, there's space for everyone to work on different things. But I just kind of wonder, what do you think? What would you do as a campaigner? What would you prioritize, particularly over the next 5 years? You know, what area would you be looking at? What do you think is the most important for kind of campaigners and activists?
But I think it's exactly as you say. It's about kind of chipping away at the hostile environment from absolutely every angle, whether that's, you know, around right to rent, which I know that JCWI have done a lot of incredible work on, the kind of new laws that came in around having to kind of check immigration status before people can access housing, which has led to loads of discrimination in that area, whether it's around kind of healthcare charges, and there's great campaigns being led by Docs Not Cops on that, whether it's around, you know, collection of data and data sharing in schools and lots of different settings. I think it's important that all of those campaigns are happening concurrently and kind of in conversation with each other. In terms of the work I do, so I work at an advice centre which supports a lot of families who have no recourse to public funds. And I think, you know, abolishing NRPF is just absolutely something that needs to happen. For those who don't know, kind of since 2012, the no recourse to public funds condition has been kind of routinely imposed on all migrants granted the legal right to live in the and work in the UK on the basis of strong family ties to this country. And it's a condition which basically prohibits people from accessing public funds, which include things like local authority housing, universal credit, housing benefit, child benefit, personal independence payments, and things like that. What it kind of means in practice is if you're struggling to get by, and you know, lots of people have lost work in the pandemic, we've seen a lot of people kind of pushed over into really untenable living situations, you very quickly end up facing destitution and homelessness because you can't access any state support, and it basically locks people out of society. It makes it impossible to just kind of survive. And we saw at the end of 2010 the death of Mercy Baguba, who was found dead next to her crying baby, who, you know, she'd been living in extreme poverty after losing her job and had no recourse to public funds. So, you know, this condition just needs to be abolished as part of the dismantling of the hostile environment. And I think it's going to become very pertinent. I haven't kind of read very closely into the announcement today. I've obviously seen the kind of top lines of it, but, you know, the idea that whether you enter the UK legally or illegally having an impact on how your asylum claim is going to play out, and more and more people being kind of shunted into this NRPF category. I mean, it's just horrifying. It's really horrifying what the impacts of that is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely, could not agree more. The thing that I think is really interesting about NRPF is it actually feels very winnable to me. It feels like one of the hostile environment policies that is so insidious but so visible and affects so many people that actually there is real momentum there to change. And I also think, you know, again, kind of thinking about what's happened to the public in the last year, how many people now recognise that they're literally just one step away from needing to be reliant on public services, and that is being thrust on migrants who are working and not working, and here legally and not legally, or, you know, undocumented. And you know, that kind of that threat and danger and insecurity plays into how people exist in their daily lives, and the kind of destitution that they face is just so visible. So I really feel like that's a campaign that a lot of people could get behind in a lot of different ways and would bring together a lot of different sectors. Before we go on to questions for the audience, I just have one last question for you. And I think, to be honest, this is mostly for me, again, to feel like something's a bit hopeful. You know, you end the book with key rebuttals for people who want to call for no borders, which I think is incredibly powerful and important to have in like one place, how we debunk a lot of the myths that are told about migrants and their communities. But the thing that I really loved was how the book ends with a call to radical love, joy and imagination. And, you know, that to me is the real heart of your book and kind of your political take on this system. So what's one piece of advice you have for people watching today for how they can bring border resistance into their daily lives and keep some of that radical joy and love?
I think I'm going to give two small pieces. One is to just keep kind of learning about the topic, reading about the topic, whether you're someone who has kind of lived experience of border violence or migration, or someone who's learning about this afresh. There's so much to be read, particularly focusing on the British context. So there's a really great book by Nadine El-Anani called Bordering Britain, which came out recently. And there's another one called Deporting Black Britons by Luke de Noronha, which is kind of 4 portraits of young Black British guys who were deported to Jamaica. And also the website I mentioned earlier, Detained Voices. These are all places where you can kind of get more of an insight into what, you know, border violence looks like in practice, and kind of equip yourself for having conversations with other people about, you know, the border isn't just about the US-Mexico wall, like it's something that's happening right here, right now in this country, and we need to start talking about it. And the other small thing is there's a really great group, or kind of loose, autonomous, non-centralized collection of groups called the Anti-Raids Network. And if you go on their website, you can learn about what to do if you see a raid. So it's very kind of practical information about if you see a raid, if you see people having kind of documents checked, it gives you like a step-by-step thing and little flyers that you can print out of what to do. So for example, you can tell the person that they can leave and they don't have to answer any questions. And you can film what's happening if the person who's kind of being questioned gives permission and things like that. So I think just kind of equipping yourself with a bit of practical knowledge about what we can do when we're out and about if we see, you know, borders being enforced in that way, and how we can kind of intervene to show kind of solidarity and care for each other.
Yeah, that I think that's really true, that a lot of people don't really know what to do in those circumstances, and that there's an element of just educating yourself on a lot of the issues. That could be a really good place for people to start. So we've got a few questions that have just been posted into the chat box to me. So Vidit Thakra says, in your professional practice, how do you identify, work around and call out the distortion of truth via English politeness and pathological conflict avoidance, which is very British?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think if I understand the question correctly, if people are kind of saying things that are, you know, racist, or if they're kind of expressing kind of anti-migrant racist sentiments, I think I often will just say, oh, I don't understand what you mean. And I'll just keep saying that until they have to either like out themselves as a racist and overtly say that, or they have to kind of begin to unpick the things that they're saying. And I think some of the FAQs, or those kind of questions, classic questions at the end of the book around like, what about the NHS? What about housing? Where's everyone going to live? The way that people tiptoe around saying, you know, I just am racist and don't want people in this country. If you start to drill down into some of the specifics of like, what is it that you're worried about? You know, what are the concerns? And then you can have very kind of practical, factual conversations about those issues if people don't want to, you know, just out themselves for who they truly are.
It is such a smart tactic to just keep saying that you don't understand what someone means, and it works really well. I think maybe you were even the person who taught me about this tactic, I'm not even sure, but it really works well in the context of like sexism and misogyny and homophobia and all of those things, when you just kind of like, sorry, I don't understand that joke. And kind of playing naive. It's a really good tactic.
It's low effort as well, so that's good.
Yeah, and it's quite fun to see people's shocked responses when they have to explain their kind of various prejudices to someone else. There's another question here from Fred Ashmore, who says, what do both of us think about the concept of alternatives to detention, a case management approach to resolving immigration cases?
I mean, I think the border shouldn't exist. I think immigration control shouldn't exist. So alternative detention, you're kind of going down that reform route of maybe kind of tweaking and trying to make the system fairer, or trying to make it easier to navigate or quicker. And the kind of border regime is premised upon inequality because of those long histories of colonization, about who can come here and who can't, and who has to jump through certain visa hoops, and who has to pay what, and whether your race or class privilege can buy you a ticket into the country. So I think we have to kind of really hold the line around the idea that border control shouldn't exist, immigration detention shouldn't exist, and deportation shouldn't exist. And what becomes difficult sometimes when there are discussions around alternatives to detention that aren't really focused on the longer goal of like ending it completely, because you can have kind of non-reformist reforms, which is another discussion altogether. But if you start saying, maybe only these types of people should be in detention, or for this amount of time, it makes it harder to then make the case for abolishing it altogether, because you've made it a bit more palatable in that process. But there is a tension there to be held about, making improvements that are going to make people's day-to-day lives better, whilst also keeping your kind of gaze, firmly trained on the idea that detention should not exist.
Yeah, I think as I completely agree with everything you just said. And I think for me, as a kind of a campaigner in like a paid role in an organization, and I've obviously got a family history of migration, but I'm not a migrant. This is kind of something that I come back to really often when I'm kind of trying to check myself and hold myself accountable for the work that I'm doing, where it's like, I have to keep the end goal in mind at all times when I'm looking at what is being proposed in front of me. So I kind of do this kind of checks and balances thing where I'm like, okay, if we call for this now, what is this going to look like in 10 years' time? And if it's going to hinder that thing in 10 years' time that I want to get to, then I don't think we should call for that right now. So, there is obviously a balance there, but I try to keep the kind of bigger picture in mind. And I think the thing with alternatives to detention is that, fine, you can have people in much better situations, kind of community detention, where they're like not policed as hard. But the reality is that detention centers do not need to exist. If there was a working asylum system, a working migration system, they would not need to be there, and you would not need alternatives to them. So for me, my focus is more holistically on fixing the other problems in the system rather than focusing on pushing for an alternative to detention. But I think as movements work and as campaigns work and anything works, you do need people calling for all different bits of the system to be fixed and changed, as well as people looking at the bigger picture in order to get somewhere. So kind of all the pieces kind of fit together. Just scrolling through these questions.
Really good questions.
Yeah, they really are. They're very kind of hard questions to answer as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to read them really quickly and think of good answers.
Yeah. So Laura Gilkinson says, how can those of us working with forced migrants or asylum seekers in frontline health services and seeing and hearing firsthand the impact of the hostile environment best amplify these experiences?
I mean, I would say definitely get involved with groups that are already campaigning on the issues, such as Docs Not Cops. I think MedAct are also doing work around this as well. I think also just if you have any, depending on whether you're a kind of junior level, or if you have any kind of decision-making role in the institution you work in, I know that obviously the NHS charging has been brought in, and particularly for people who've given birth, they're incurring these, massive NHS debts. But NHS trusts have the power to waive those debts, to kind of write them off for administrative purposes. So if you're in any kind of position of that level of power in a healthcare institution where you can say, I can see the hostile environment is trying to make me do this thing, but I actually have a loophole where I can waive this debt if somebody is destitute, engaging in that work with kind of care and compassion and open-mindedness. But definitely check out, perhaps you already have and are involved, but places like Docs Not Cops and MedAct, who are working on this issue specifically with healthcare workers.
Yeah, I think we can drop some of those organisations in the chat, but we'll also send you guys a follow-up email with some of the organisations and groups that have been mentioned in the conversation today. So we've got another question from Jackie Epps, who says, do you think there is a generation division in the attitudes to these issues? And are young people more aware of prejudices, whereas maybe the older generation are more prepared to accept the status quo?
What do you think, Minnie?
I find this really hard because I don't really like the concept of, oh, but they're from a different generation, because if you're alive right now, you're of this generation, so you can see what's happening around you, and you kind of you should be willing to challenge it. I think maybe younger people are having a much harder time than kind of like some of the the kind of the boomer generation, not to use that term rudely, but the boomer generation. Young people have really seen a lot of terrible stuff happen to them. They've had a lot of access cut, and they also have a much more improved access to information. So I think they are able to be more vocal where they might not have been previously. But as you mentioned in the book, protest has happened by young people in every single generation who will now be older. So I'm not sure whether it's a generational divide or a political divide.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. I think also I also don't know that the older generation are more prepared to accept the status quo. I mean, I don't have the stats, but like a lot of the older people that I know and activists who were, came up through the 70s and 80s, like they are not accepting the status quo. They're absolutely still working on these issues, maybe in different ways, using different tactics and different approaches. But I think a kind of intergenerational approach is going to be pretty fundamental to getting any wins. So yeah, I agree with what you said, Minnie.
Yeah. We've got probably time for maybe 2 more questions. So I've got one here from graduate 1104 who says, from both, any thoughts on who needs to be in the room to develop an empathetic and action-orientated narrative around abolition and getting to abolition?
I mean, I think it needs to be everyone. And I think it needs to be such a broad conversation. I was speaking with Helen Brewer, who was one of the Stansted 15 who stopped a charter flight. She kind of was speaking a bit about how abolition is not just about tearing down structures. We need to be having conversations across disciplines, across industries, about what do we want to build? What is the community of care and compassion and strength and solidarity that we want to build, which is going to create this world where we don't, prisons are obsolete, where immigration controls are obsolete. I mean, I already think, but both of those things are obsolete, but in a very practical sense. When you talk about something like prison abolition, we're talking about working together to build a world where there's adequate mental health care, where there's adequate housing, where there's employment, where there's training, where we've done a lot of unlearning around misogyny and the different kind of rape culture, the different patterns of thoughts and behaviors which provide those conducive contexts to violence which people get locked up for. So I think everybody needs to be around the table. It needs to be a big creative discussion, not in the sense of abolition being this like pie in the sky fantasy idea, but just like fully believing and living the truth that a different world is possible and working together to kind of sketch out the map for how we're going to get there. And like that work is already being done in different ways in different spaces, but the more people that engage, the more sectors that see abolition of kind of oppressive racist structures as relevant to the work they're doing, I think the better, the more fruitful those conversations will be.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that I would add to that is we see abolition, or the kind of public view abolition, as the removing of something that is valued to them. But actually, abolition in many ways is more of the things that benefit them. So it's more resources to stuff that would support them. It is more rights for people who currently don't have them. And those those battles, those fights for more rights have benefited everyone, from kind of, you know, women's rights started at a place and it has progressed to support more women, and workers' rights, you know, kind of when you improve rights for migrant workers, you improve rights for everyone in the workplace. And I think that kind of the conversation about abolition is so negatively framed, when actually it's more of the stuff that is good for us. And I think that's the thing that I would that I like to focus on when we talk about kind of abolition.
Yeah, it's that thing that Bell Hooks talks about of building from the margin to the center. So if we build our kind of approaches and our solutions for the most kind of marginalized groups, then they will trickle through and be beneficial to everybody within society. If you just start building in the middle for the most privileged people, it's not going to like trickle out and work for everybody. We need to start at the margin and build to the center.
Definitely. And I think we've got time for just one more question. So Brittany J says, how does patriotism reproduce the violence of borders? Is there a way to love people and place without borders?
I think yes would be maybe too simple an answer, but like that is what I think. I think yeah, I'm not a patriot or a nationalist, but I think you can love, and in fact must love, and like care for the place where you live, not just in terms of a fondness, but you know, the stewardship of the land and caring for the environment and caring for each other. I think that's really, really important. Borders don't actually like demarcate, I mean they kind of do on maps, you know, demarcate the edges of lands. It's not, you don't step over the border and suddenly become a different person. They're kind of political entities, and entities that mark out the edge of a nation state. And I think without borders we can still have kind of distinct, you know, national identities, and people can group together in distinct national ways, but it doesn't have to be framed within this idea of like, you don't deserve to be in here and I don't want to be over there, and becoming this kind of antagonistic exclusion based idea.
Yeah, and I think actually this question ties perfectly back to how you conclude the book, which is about kind of redefining what it means to kind of, you know, that idea of radical love is basically redefining who we love and how we love them, and how we kind of interact with our land and our communities. And the way we do that currently is really siloed and really differentiated, and based a lot on people's identities as what they look like and not who they actually are. So I think that kind of brings us really nicely back to me telling everyone that they must absolutely buy and read Leah's book. It is an incredible piece of writing. It's really moving, and I think it will have a lot of answers to these questions. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and also to thank Leah, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks so much, Minnie, and thanks to Roseanne who asked